This is the journey to One Africa.
The question of African unity is one that has preoccupied many Africans, particularly in the post-colonial era. But it's important to appreciate that prior to the advent of colonization, there was an Africa. And that Africa did not have ironclad boundaries. But after colonization, the struggle for African unity gained new momentum. But that must be seen in the context of history. When through slavery, Africans had been taken to different parts of the world, the urge for the freed slaves to come back to Africa gained new momentum. And indeed, the whole idea of Pan-Africanism was incubated in the Caribbean's individuals such as Sylvester Williams, Marcus Garvey, John Henrik Lewis, W.B. Du Bois, and many others were in the forefront of convening meetings in the 19th century, culminating in the much more famous Pan-African meeting held in Manchester in 1945. So when the momentum for decolonization took place, Africa was seeking to decolonize, not as a continent in that homogeneous sense, but to decolonize in the context of the individual countries arbitrarily created in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 by the colonizing European powers. So the British colonies were seeking independence from Britain, the French, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Spaniards, the Belgians, and the Dutch. It is in that context that we must understand the idea of African unity post-colonization. And the idea of African unity started to emerge immediately after the independence of Ghana. It is Kwame Nkurumah on the 6th day of March 1957 who famously said, "The independence of Ghana means nothing if the rest of Africa is not free." And sometimes when we say this, those who know that Sudan was created in 1956 say that Ghana was not the first country to regain independence. But we say so because Ghana's independence was unique. It was a pronouncement by the Osagyefo Kwame Nkurumah that it heralded a new beginning. And to Nkrumah's credit, no sooner had Ghana gained independence as Ghana having been Gold Coast, then he started the movement towards African unity. And he says he convenes a meeting immediately after that in 1961 in Morocco. And thereafter he convenes a meeting that calls upon the others to embrace unity. And some of the individuals who very quickly embrace Nkurumah's exhortation is Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania. Nyerere tells the leaders of East African countries, namely Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Apollo Milton Obote of Uganda, that he is prepared to persuade his colleagues in Tanganyika to delay the independence of Tanganyika so that Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika can become independent as one country. And it is instructive how selfless Nyerere was in that regard. He said, "I propose that Kenyatta, being the eldest, become the president of East Africa. As for me, I won't mind even if I'm an envoy at the UN." Of course, we know that that did not happen. And A little later, in 1963, the 32 independent countries, you can see the wave of independence. 32 countries are represented in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, from the 23rd to the 24th to the 25th days of May. In 1963, hosted by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. And once again, each one of those leaders, if you read the 32 speeches, are quite clear. They are saying, we need to unite. But at that time, what we don't say is that the European colonizers have started infiltrating African countries to ensure that the unity contemplated by Kwame Nkurumah and others is not achieved. So the leaders meet in Addis Ababa through two distinct streams. The Casablanca group, which wants unity now, and the Monrovia group, which says, no, we think unity is a good idea, but let us do it gradually. And Kwame Nkurumah says on the 24th, I think that is the day he delivered his speech, he says, we must unite, because if we don't unite, the neo-colonial powers are going to manipulate us. They are going to ensure that we do not unite politically, economically, militarily, and otherwise. And he makes a proposal. Ultimately, that is not achieved, and we end up with a very weak organization called the Organization of African Unity. The following year in Cairo in 1964, Gamal Abdel Nasser holds a meeting, and one of the issues to be discussed at that meeting is how do we deal with these artificial boundaries? Do we begin to redraw the boundaries? And the wisdom of the day is that it is unwise, because if you begin to redraw the boundaries, then you will have chaos throughout the continent of Africa. And that is how the idea of the inviolability of inherited boundaries comes about, and the idea of ensuring that no country, no sister or brother country interferes with the sovereignty of the other. 1964, Cairo, Egypt. Immediately after that, the following year, Kwame Nkurumah hosts a meeting in Accra, Ghana in 1965 with only two agenda items. One is to ensure that the hitherto colonized countries, the remaining ones, are liberated, and number two, African unity. Of course, it does not happen. And it is not a surprise that 1 year later, Nkurumah is actually overthrown, because the forces that are arrayed against African unity are numerous. If Africa unites, then Africa is going to be a major world power. If Africa unites, then her resources cannot be exploited. If Africa unites, then there will be a disequilibrium in international politics, which is now a bipolar, with the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States of America on the other hand being the leader of the conceptual West. So what happens, of course, is that we begin to see a series of coup d'etats which have been manufactured in order to torpedo the unity of Africa. But it must be remembered that that started a little earlier. In 1961, Patrice Emery Lumumba had already been eliminated, and in 1963, there had already been a coup d'etat in Togo, where Sylvanus Olympio had also been removed from power. So what one sees is a concerted effort by the neo-colonizers that Africa cannot be free. Nkurumah had just written a book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism and the Most Dangerous. But to come back to the question of unity, much, much later, 40 years after Ghana regained her independence, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, on the 6th day of March 1997, is invited as the guest in Accra, Ghana, And he says many things, but one of the most iconic statements, he says, without unity, there is no future for Africa. He says Nkurumah had told us that if we do not unite, there'll be a multiplicity of presidents and prime ministers, ministers and ambassadors. There'll be a multiplicity of flags and national anthems, and the population of people with vested interests who want to ensure that there is no African unity will have grown because they fear to lose power and privilege. But he says, Mwalimu Nyerere, our generation had a duty to do certain things, among them to bring about political liberation. Every generation has a duty. We too now are passing over the torch and the baton at once to the next generation to do what they must do, to unite Africa. And he says, there'll be many trials, many tribulations in the journey towards unity. But of all the mistakes we have made, the worst mistake that we can ever make is the mistake of despair. We must never afford that. So unity, in a nutshell, is critical to enable Africa to realize our potential. There are those who, when they hear us talking about unity, think we are simplistic, even naive. They think we are moralizing, intellectualizing, philosophizing, romanticizing. No, we are not. And we do not talk about the unity of the grave. We are talking about a unity that is celebrated in diversity. And that is achievable and indeed desirable, because disunity is a lot more expensive. It makes Africa susceptible to manipulation. And there is no shortage of evidence to demonstrate that a disunited Africa has been manipulated, has been ravished. Unity is the magic bullet. Let's understand African unity. You know what happened in Addis Ababa in 1963 by the creation, or with the creation of the Organization of African Unity, is that the forces against unity were very strong. So the OAU was actually a weakened body, as some used to say, a toothless bulldog. And when African leaders meet in Sirte in Egypt, hosted by the late Muammar al-Gaddafi, they say OAU has had problems, but it cannot be denied that she has participated in ensuring that independence is regained, but it is not the body that we need going forward. The body that we need going forward is a much more powerful body, a body that is one that rekindles the spirit of unity. So in Sirte, the decision is made that that body must change its name. That is how the African Union is born. And then it is actually delivered in Durban in South Africa in the year 2002 with the intention of midwifing a process that will lead to African unity politically, economically, and otherwise. So the African Union is the body that is designed to achieve that, because it is a development by refinement from the Organization of African Unity. Has it done that? Has it achieved that? No. Is it too early to judge? Yes, it is. The struggle towards unity is one that is long and tortuous. And remember that even within the continent of Africa, there are people who do not desire unity. They want to be big sharks in small ponds. Outside of the continent of Africa, as I've already indicated, there are forces that would not like Africa to unite, because divide them and rule them. Can the AU achieve it? What has the AU done since it came into being, or since it was pronounced as the immediate successor of the OAU? A number of useful things. a number of declarations. Number one, in the year 2013, the heads of states and government birthed the Agenda 2063, which is a grand blueprint that says Africa shall develop on this path on the basis of 7 pillars, and ultimately that will ensure that Africa becomes an important player in the world arena. We have seen that it has tried to harmonize African activities in critical areas. In the area of agriculture, for example, we saw what was done under the Maputo Declaration, I think, of 2004, the Malabo Declaration of 2013, again the Malabo Declaration of 2022, in order to focus on agriculture. On women, we have the Maputo Declaration. On the airspace, we have the Yamoussoukro Declaration of 1988. In the health sector, we have the Abuja Declaration of 2001. And of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, whose agenda is to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers. So I think that the African Union, despite its weaknesses, despite the fact that it lacks funding, remember that nearly 60% of the African Union budget is externally funded, which is sad. Until the day that we begin to fund our activities, unity will always be a mirage. And I think that going forward, what we need to do is not to create new institutions, but to energize existing institutions by having them populated by Pan-Africanists. And I'm suggesting that one of the weaknesses of the African Union is that the individuals who have been given the honor and privilege of leading her have not done a good job. I think, of course, that Nkosazana and Lamini Zuma of South Africa tried to do a good job. The current holder, Mohamed Faki, has not been as enthusiastic as I would want him to be. But he does argue, and perhaps there is merit in that argument, that he does not have the necessary political support. But in a nutshell, I'm saying that the AU is the body that we must use. A bad workman and a bad workwoman, if you may, blames the tools. I'm not just about to say that the AU ought to be, the AU ought to be eliminated, but it ought to be strengthened for the sake of African unity. A united Africa must be an Africa that is at peace with herself. And what do I mean peace? Do I mean peace that is the peace of the graveyard, where everybody agrees with everybody else? No, I cannot possibly mean that. Because within the continent of Africa, there are different nations. And these nations find themselves in the modern African state. So that if you go to South Africa, for example, there is the Zulu nation, there is the Xhosa nation, there is the Pedi nation, there is the Swana nation. You go to Nigeria, you'll find different nations, the Yoruba nation, the Igbo nation, the Ibibio nation. If you go to Ghana, you'll find the Ga nation, the Ewe nation, the Ashanti nation. You go to Uganda, you find the Binyoro Kitara, you find the Baganda. You come to Kenya, you find the Luo, you find the Agikoyo, you find the Ameru, you find the Kalenjin, the Waluya. You go to Ethiopia, you find the Tigray, you find the Oromo. You go to southern Cameroons, you find different peoples. So one of the things that we must do in order to have an Africa that is united properly is that the internal contradictions within the countries, the conflicts that are now raging in places such as Cameroon or in Democratic Republic of Congo or in Darfur in Sudan or in Ethiopia or in Somalia must be resolved. Once they are resolved, the current boundaries, if they are to be retained, will be for purposes of administration. So the Africa that I see is a confederal Africa. Is an Africa which has a headquarters somewhere, as Kwame Nkurumah used to say, that it should be headquartered in Bangui in Central African Republic because it is central. But now that we have Addis Ababa as the headquarters, it can be in Addis Ababa. That is the headquarters. An Africa that has one president. An Africa that has governors in her component units. An Africa which is represented in other parts of the world by single ambassadors. We eliminate the 54 of them. An Africa that has a cabinet, an Africa that borrows from the experiences of others and adapts them. The Confederal Constitution in Little Switzerland can be a beginning point. The manner in which the United States of America governs our states could be the traditional rulers who are to be found in different parts of Africa also to be given their pride of place. In other words, the big task now is to say, how will we have this new architecture that allows Africa to thrive in her diversity? She must have one military, and she must have one military commander. She must have a confederal police system, but with components of policing being left to the others. We must have an educational system which allows for credit transfer. If I'm at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Senegal and I want to move to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia with my credits, I should be able to do so. We must have an adopted lingua franca. Swahili has already been chosen as an adopted lingua franca to be used. But if we want to choose any other language, we can do so. We can choose Amhara, we can choose Yoruba, but Kiswahili is the language. So that Africa is an Africa that speaks with one voice. Will that Africa be immune from difficulties? No. It is the nature of any human enterprise that it will always have its trials and tribulations. It is how we mediate those conflicts that makes us stronger. But that Africa is possible, that Africa is desirable. Even if we don't achieve it in our lifetime, it is a task that we are giving to successive generations. It is an intergenerational battle and quest. Let me address the reality as it is now. Africa is divided into several regional economic communities: SADC, ECOWAS, East African Community, the Maghreb, Central Africa. And it would appear to me that the movement towards unity may very well follow regional integration. The region that is closest to that integration is actually the East African region. Remember that prior to 1977, we had a very robust East African community. It collapsed. And in 1990, we have now clawed it back. And you may or may not know, but as I speak to you now, there is a committee of experts that is going around East African community countries to collect views on the federal or the confederal East African Constitution. If that were to happen, you would then have unified Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and of course the Johnny come lately is Democratic Republic of Congo and Somalia, and very soon I hope even Ethiopia. Then you have something from which to start. Look at the United States of America. When the leaders of the United States of America met in Philadelphia in 1776 and said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable right, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that it is for this reason that governments are instituted amongst men. There were 13 states, 13 original states. The rest then joined. And there are now 50 of them with 2 regions. So it must start somewhere. So I think that the regions will then move in that direction. SADC will then be strengthened in that regard. ECOWAS strengthened in that regard. The Maghreb, if they choose not to be duplicitous, as sometimes they are, whether they're in the Arab League or the African Union, then we will then move towards an African Union. That, I think, is the much more practical route, is a route that is already being taken as I speak. Now, the beauty of human history is that we can learn from the experiences of others. We now know why, for example, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union was a product of the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was a product of a bottoms-up approach. In other words, the people were not involved. It was not people-centered, and therefore it was always bound to collapse when the internal contradictions took place. So we know that if you don't have a process that is generated from the bottom, then it will collapse because the centrifugal forces will be very strong. So we know, let us have a bottoms-up approach in order to have the people involved, people participation, so that they understand what it is that is being done. And that is why, for example, in the East African Community Treaty says we start with a customs union, a common market, and ultimately a political federation. So we learn from the Soviet Union that it must not be top-down. And the same with Yugoslavia. It happened in the same way during the reign of Joseph Broz Tito. It was also a top-down approach. So the answer to the question at hand is that any sustainable approach must be one that comes from the people and is people-centered. And if it is people-centered, then it can't be dealt with. The European model, which started from the Coal and Steel Union in the 1950s, was one that was essentially an economic union. And then it grew into a monetary union and is struggling to be a political union. We have seen even with the Brexit. So there are things to learn from. And even within the African continent, there have been attempts at unity, small as they would have been. We remember Modibo Keita and the Osagie for Kwame Nkurumah and Ahmed Sékou Touré tried to unite Ghana, Conakry, and Mali. We also remember that Dauda Kairaba Jawara and Leopold Sédar Senghor tried to unite Senegal and the Gambia. Now we know. We have learned from history, and I believe we are going to avoid those. We are going to and must indeed avoid those landmines so that when we are moving forward, we move a lot more confidently and we carry the people along with us. And if we do so, then it will be a lot more sustainable. That is not to say that we'll have eliminated conflicts. No, conflicts will always be there in any human enterprise. Is how we mediate and resolve those conflicts that is important going forward. And I think we have the intellectual wherewithal to do that. In fact, it is very desirable. In fact, I've just been seeing the African Exim Bank are saying that if Africa were to have a single payment system, as indeed is being worked towards, it would save the continent $5 billion United States dollars annually. Remember that I speak to you today, nearly 80 to 90% of transactions emanating from Africa are terminated in the United States dollars. If you have a card, a credit card, that transaction goes to the United States of America. If you are to transfer money from Nairobi, Kenya, and you wanted to go to Rwanda, the corresponding bank will possibly be in the United States of America or in Europe. And that kind of situation is undesirable, which begs the question, do we need a single currency? Yes, we do. Once again, can it be a big bang thing where we have a single African currency called the Afro, or whichever name we choose? I think once again it will be regional. We now said, initially in East Africa, for example, we said by the year 2024, we ought to have had a single currency. It's not going to happen. And now we are saying we'll have a single currency by the year 2031. In ECOWAS, they had actually started working towards a single currency, the ECO, until the French came and torpedoed it through La Côte d'Ivoire. In South Africa, I think once again that will happen. But the single payment system that is being introduced under the Africa Exim Bank could even expedite and catalyze the process so that we have a single currency. But it's important that before you have a single currency, you work on economic fundamentals. If you don't do so, you'll you'll be caught up by what in Europe now is known as the Greek tragedy, the modern Greek tragedy, where the economic fundamentals are not working as well. So it is important. If you remember in Europe, from which we can learn in this regard, before the euro was introduced, there were many currencies in Europe which did not work as well. The Italian lira was infamous for the quantity that you needed to buy bread. The peseta in Spain, the drachma in Greece. And ultimately, what happened is that Portugal, Spain, Greece were required to meet certain standards before they joined the currency zone. That is what we must do. We must make sure that the afro, if that is the currency we are going to adopt in Africa, means the same things in terms of real value to the Burundian as it does to the person in Eswatini, as it does to the person in Benin or in the Gambia. And this is the work that I would myself want to hear our ministers for finance talk about. This is what I would want to hear our governors of central banks talk about. But I don't hear it often enough. In fact, I hold the view, with the speed that is now gaining momentum, particularly with the BRICS, and the increasing noise about de-dollarization, I think that if we work at it, and this is the most important thing, if we work at it, in the next 20 years, we should have a single African country, a single African currency. 20 years. But it must be worked at. It's not just pronouncements. It is working at it. Having drawn experience from Babylon, and it's not only in the Bible. If you go to different books, even if you go to the Mahabharata in Hindu mythology, we saw how Hastinapur or Indraspath fell. I hold the view that we can avoid the Babylon experience. How do we avoid the Babylon experience? By ensuring that we democratize our systems. What do I mean democratize? Enhance people participation. The reason why the Babylons fell is because those who were in leadership thought they were gods to rule by fiat and dictates. And as the people became awakened, then they rebelled against them. So history's lesson, always ensure that a critical mass of the people understand what you are doing and have a buy-in. Once they have a buy-in in any process, they'll be the protectors. You'll need no army. The way away from Babylon is people participation. Unity is the mother's milk of political cohesion. It is the mother's milk of economic development. It is the mother's milk of spiritual liberation and mental decolonization. And if it is going to happen, it is the young men and women in Africa who must rise and must be committed. History has been consistent. The young must always be at the center of any struggle. And when they get older, they recruit another band of young men and women. Unity spearheaded by young men, directed by old men and women. That is what is sustainable.